In a world with an ever-growing number of mouths to feed, fertilisers have become a key part of how we manage to do that. However, they're becoming increasingly expensive and damage the water, soil and atmosphere that crops rely on. The issue recently gained the spotlight via a report from the UK's Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. So let's dig in and understand why fertilisers are both so essential and problematic, and what could be done to fix that. In order to grow, plants take in a variety of nutrients from the soil, 17 of them in fact, but with the main ones being nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. However, when the plants are harvested and leave the ground, they take those nutrients with them, which is why most soils don't have enough nutrients for repeated growing of crops. That's where fertilisers come in, to replace those nutrients and support plant development. Now, their use is very widespread. As of 2015, more than 50% of the global population was fed with crops grown with artificial fertilisers. That is where the biggest economic concern about fertilisers comes in. As fertilisers are so essential, their price can skyrocket during times of limited supply or economic shock. During the 2008 financial crisis, for instance, the price of phosphorus-based fertilisers increased by 850%. And in the years since then, prices have continued to surge. The price of British nitrogen-based fertiliser increased by 152% between May of 2021 and 2022. Therefore, farmers are having to think very carefully about how much fertiliser they can afford, whether they can use less, and if there's any alternatives available. Currently, fertilisers come in all shapes and sizes, from slurries to pellets to powders, and there are straight fertilisers which contain just one nutrient, and there are compound ones which contain a variety. What 97% of fertilisers have in common, though, is that they are artificially produced, and so they are not natural. And unfortunately, from this manufacturing process all the way through to their application onto crops, they're damaging the environment. During the manufacture of artificial fertilisers, a lot of greenhouse gases are produced. Globally, production of artificial nitrogen-based fertilisers emits 450 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year. What's arguably worse, though, is everything that happens after fertilisers have been applied to crops. When microbes in the soil break down nitrogen-based fertilisers, a gas called nitrous oxide is released, which has a global warming potential of 300 times that of carbon dioxide. And as it's so potent, that's partly why these types of emissions, those from after fertiliser has been applied to a crop, account for 2/3 of the total emissions produced by fertilisers. On top of that, despite topping up nutrients, fertilisers aren't actually that great for the soil in the long run. That's because they change its chemistry, making it not quite as livable and thus reducing the biodiversity in the soil. And the heavy machinery used to apply fertilisers out onto fields compacts the soil, which has a knock-on effect of reducing aeration, drainage, and ultimately usually soil erosion. Finally, it's common for some amount of fertiliser to be washed away into lakes and streams if there's been heavy rainfall or if too much has been applied. Once in the water, those nutrients in the fertilisers can cause algal blooms in a process called eutrophication. This chokes the waterway of oxygen and ultimately will kill any aquatic life which called it home. So in summary, although fertilisers are really important to global food production, there are concerns about their economics, pollution and contribution to climate change. Is there anything to be done? Well, good news is that yes, there is. We can mitigate some current issues, we can optimise our use of fertiliser, and we could replace artificial fertilisers. Let me explain. Those 450 million tonnes of carbon dioxide released each year from producing nitrogen-based fertilisers, well, 90% of those emissions come from obtaining hydrogen from fossil fuels to use in the production process. There are, however, renewable alternatives. For instance, hydrogen can cleanly be obtained from water using a process called electrolysis. Cleanly, so long as the power required to do so is produced by a renewable source. To meet current needs, around 233.6 million tonnes of water would be needed each year, which might be a little bit tricky in areas of water scarcity, albeit some ways to use seawater in the process are set to make that easier. Now, to mitigate pollution by runoff, one big idea is to use buffer zones of vegetation between fields and freshwater habitats that can catch the fertilisers before they enter the water. There's actually incentive for this already in the UK. Farmers who apply to the Sustainable Farming Incentive can opt to be paid £451 per hectare each year to establish and maintain buffer strips. Now, as good as those mitigation options are, they don't really do much in the way of tackling the emissions and damage caused by fertilisers being applied to cropland, nor does it do much to reduce the cost of the process. That is where optimisation techniques come in. You see, adding more fertiliser helps to increase crop yield, but only up to a certain point. The UK in fact wastes £397 million of fertiliser each year due to over-application. Farmers could cut their usage back by as much as half without seeing a major reduction in crop yield. Denmark has successfully done this. It implemented a series of policies in conjunction with monitoring and enforcement that nearly halved its nitrogen fertiliser use from 1990 to 2011, all whilst keeping its agricultural production pretty stable. There are other ways to increase efficiency as well. There's a range of technologies which enable precision application of fertiliser, using spatial information to modify how much is applied where, and it can have enormous savings, perhaps as much as 60%. Another challenge is that crops sometimes aren't all that great at taking up fertilisers, taking in and using only 30 to 40% of the nutrients. To fix this, you can either modify the crop, either with selective breeding or, controversially, genetically, to take on more nutrients, or you can modify the fertiliser to make it release nutrients more slowly to improve uptake. What about all of the soil degradation issues? Well, you can optimise for soil health as well, either with rotating crops, where you grow different crops on a patch of land each year, or with intercropping, where you grow multiple different crops together, or by introducing cover crops, which are grown specifically to improve soil health. Which is good because healthy soil retains water better and recycles nutrients more, which means that you can increase the efficiency of your fertilisers and actually reduce the amount that you need. But finally, would it do any good to replace artificial fertilisers with something more natural? Well, quite possibly, yes. Organic fertilisers like livestock manure, treated sewage and compost are an alternative that can provide nutrients to the soil, improve soil texture and provide long-term fertilisation. They do still release some greenhouse gases when they're applied to crops, but less than their artificial counterparts. Studies have suggested that organic fertilisers have the potential to replace artificial fertilisers in some cases, however, not entirely. The reasons being is that their nutrient content is less predictable than that of artificial fertilisers, and that currently they're impractical and expensive to transport long distances. As well as organic fertilisers though, there are also a wide range of bacteria, fungi and algae that have been classified as biofertilisers. They're particularly good at increasing crops' capacity to take on the important nutrients that we mentioned: nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus. There's also evidence that they can improve plant health, as well as tolerance to salt and drought. Right now there are some concerns over their shelf life and their storage requirements, but it is believed that further investment could help bring them to a better level of readiness as a technology. All that will remain then is for regulators to make an assessment over the impacts of introducing non-native soil microbiomes. Now, all of this won't come without its challenges. As we've seen before on the channel is the case with farming technologies, it's investment that is needed in order to bring their technologies to a good readiness level, and to make risk-averse farmers open to incorporating them. This will require training and knowledge, and a more sturdy evidence base for the long-term effects of these changes. Cooperation will be needed. For instance, livestock and manure production is mainly in the west of England, whilst crops dominate the east. That and river catchments are vast and shared. Plus, a just transition will need to be made so that these changes don't come at the disadvantage of farmers or consumers who would be very badly impacted by increasing food costs. All in all though, despite it being a long road ahead, it is positive to see that although fertilisers are a key part of the world's food sector, that there are things that can be done to mitigate their issues, to optimise their use, and perhaps even replace artificial fertilisers with organic or bio alternatives, all to reduce the economic burden on farmers and to do some good for the local environment and for the planet. Thanks for watching this episode of Science Affairs. If you found it interesting, then you'll probably also enjoy a video that we made about how farming robots and other tech will be saving Britain's food supply. So consider checking that out. Otherwise, if you haven't already, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on the science informing today's policy.